Yeah, welcome to the second part, second talk of the part 6 of the International Christian University Linguistic Colloquium that's organized with the theme of prosody. In fact, this talk is the very last talk of the series. So we had 12 talks scheduled, and this is the 12th talk in the series of this. So I'm really excited that now the series is nicely rounding up. I'm happy to introduce the second speaker, Lauren Clemens, Dr. Lauren Clemens. Lauren is primarily interested in generative syntax and the syntax prosody interface, and she's working or has worked on data from the Austronesian and Mayan families. Recent projects, in her recent projects, she investigated the syntactic and prosodic constituency in Nuian, or Polynesian language, and verb initial word orders in the Polynesian and Mayan families, as well as the syntactic and prosodic encoding of focus in Chol, another Mayan language, and Copalatrique on Otomanguean language in Mexico. Lauren is also working closely involved with the Copalatrique community in Albany, New York. We met actually just slightly 2 years ago, I think in 2018, late 2018 at the Nominals, at the interface meeting that was organized at Seunghun University in Seoul. Then Lauren also had a chance to come to Japan and had a workshop in Mitaka. And it's good to have you back at ICU today, and also to the Japanese community. Today, Lauren will talk about prosodic phrasing in Rutooro, a Bantu language of Uganda. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be meeting with you this morning or this evening. And this has been a great example of making the best of new Zoom world. So thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm going to go ahead and share. We did this already, but it's going to still take me a minute. Okay. Yeah. Are we good? Can you still hear me and still see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is a prosodic phrasing talk. There'll be a fair amount of syntax in it, but you already know that I'm a syntactician, so you'll forgive me, I'm sure. I'm also presenting joint work with my colleague, Lee Bickmore, who unfortunately could not be here this evening. All right, so I'm going to start by contextualizing the project a little bit, because of course, Lee is a Bantu phonologist and I'm a syntactician, and so contextualizing a little bit about why we're working together on this project. So, you know, we were interested in looking for problems in the mapping between syntactic and prosodic constituents, and especially those that push the boundaries of a particular module of the grammar. That is something that motivates me a lot in my work. And so we're looking at prosodically informed syntax and syntactically informed prosody. So this is a project that is meant to have these two modules communicating with each other and to deepen our understanding of a particular phenomena. And then to have a well-articulated interface theory as well. And the benefits of this type of approach, in our view, is both empirical and theoretical. So empirically, this means more complete coverage and documentation and richer description if we are both considering the prosodic phenomena as well as the syntactic structure. And then there's also theoretical gains here because especially if you're looking at phenomena that appear to be syntactic, but maybe they're actually prosodic, then this brings some theoretical parsimony and it has a potential to reduce the redundancy in our explanations. So if something is actually an interface phenomena, as opposed to needing to have both a prosodic explanation as well as a syntactic explanation, then there's some theoretical benefits to that. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to establish correlation between syntactic phrases and phonological phrases in Rutooro, and then demonstrate that the distribution of high tones can be used as a diagnostic for whether an nominal is generated in an internal or external position, and that's part of the syntactic analysis. We'll look at reduced relative clauses in particular because they're somewhat exceptional, and ultimately we'll argue that their exceptions are the result of genuine ambiguity and something that we described as indeterminate prosodic structure. We're going to rely on these two things to explain why we find syntax prosody isomorphisms in this particular context. Indeterminate prosodic structure we'll define as prosodic structure that could be the output of more than one syntactic configuration. All right, so we'll go on to the data. So Rutooro is spoken in Western Uganda. I'm giving you examples of closely related languages. There's been some work, so Kaji has a word list and a couple of papers on tone that take a primarily diachronic perspective, and then Lee also has a couple of other phonologically oriented papers as well. Oh, and I should say that the data come from one speaker who was traveling regularly between upstate New York and Uganda. Okay, so words in isolation are realized with a prominence that is not found in the orthography. And here it's marked with an acute accent. So here are some examples of nouns, an adverb, a verb, and there's you can see the prominence and the penultimate syllable. The distribution of high tones is non-trivial in phrasal contexts. And here's an example where the high tones fall distinguishes between a complex nominal and a nominal predicate, and I will play these for you. So here's the noun adjective combination.
Omwana mucheke.
So omwana doesn't have that high tone, but mucheke does.
Omwana mucheke.
And you can hear the difference hopefully between those two. I'll play it one more time.
Omwana mucheke. Omwana mucheke.
Okay. Oops. Okay, so when larger sentences are examined, it's possible to find just about any combination of low and high marked words. So in 7, we have an entire sentence where there's only one high tone and it appears all the way on the end. In 8, here's a clause where every single word in the sentence has a high tone. Okay, so what we've argued is that this is pretty straightforward. The domain for high tone assignment in Rutooro overlaps with what has been called the phonological phrase for other languages. And so we'll say that the high tone docks to the penultimate syllable of the phonological phrase, and this should be very familiar and comfortable to those of you with experience in Bantu. This in and of itself is not unique at all. So let's look at matrix clauses. We have intransitives, the subject and the verb each bear a high tone. So these are just simple intransitive clauses, SV order. Both subject and verb have their own high tone. Intransitives, the verb is all low and the object is marked with the high tone. So in 12, we have a pro-drop, so there's no overt subject, we just have the verb and the object. The verb is all low, the object then has the high tone. In 13, we have an overt subject, and we still have that boundary between the subject and the verb, but the verb doesn't have its own high tone. In ditransitives, we have a high tone on both the direct and indirect objects. The verb here is still all low. And I do apologize, I'm going a little bit fast, perhaps to get all of the, to really examine these sentences, but the patterns are pretty straightforward. Adjuncts, the verb surfaces is all low, and each constituent that follows is marked with a high. So this is the same as internal arguments. So this pattern with adjuncts looks very similar to arguments. So we have, we'll look at 16. We have the parents drove the car on Sunday. We have the object phrases with the verb, but then the Sunday XP has its own high phrase and separated from the object. And then they wrote slowly. We have slowly phrasing with the verb right. All right, so subjects are separated from predicates by the phonological phrase boundary. Clause final verbs are phrased alone. The verb is phrased together with the first element that follows, and every subsequent element is phrased separately. So every syntactic phrase is its own phonological phrase after the first one that phrases with the verb. All right, so we have very straightforward, strong evidence for correlation between XPs and phonological phrases. And here the square brackets are meant to represent the boundaries of the XPs, and then showing the right edge of the phonological phrase, because it happens to be that high tone docks in the penultimate syllable of the phonological phrase. All right, so I'm going to show a syntactic structure of what we imagine, and I'm basing this in part on what we know about Bantu syntax, as well as what we know about Rutooro. So I'm going to show a syntactic tree with mood P, which is a projection that hosts the final vowel and is the final landing site for the verb. The internal structure of the verb stem is consistent with the mirror principle, and this is in part because head movement is adopted. We're adopting head movement in order to be consistent with the mirror principle. In terms of the subject, we're following the VP internal subject hypothesis, so the subject moves into local configuration with T for the purpose of agreement, which results in the subject class marker being expressed on the verb. The one thing that may catch your attention in the structure I'm about to show you is that the external argument moves into the topic position in matrix clauses. This is not a particular, we don't have particularly good arguments for that, but it seems consistent with other languages that have been investigated in detail that are closely related and have similar structures. So a lot of the arguments follow, there's nothing unique from these data to support this position, but it's consistent. All right, so here's an example of the clause. Kajumba will buy the shoes. So we've seen, so we have head movement of the verb into the mood head. We have a subject that starts internally and moves higher into the clause, ending in a high CP position. I should pause here to let you take that in. All right, so now the next thing, so I had shown you this phrase about prosodically informed syntax, and how at the beginning of the talk about how prosody and syntax can work together. So now what we're going to do is consider the right edges of XPs as the right edges of phonological phrases, and use high tones as a syntactic diagnostic. So taking the prosodically informed syntax, taking the prosody and seeing what it can and tell us about the underlying syntactic structures. All right, and we're going to do that in the nominal domain. So we have two types of nominal phrases based on the distribution of high tones and constituent order. One, these are just terms that I'm using for convenience. So the head and type 1 modifiers, which are always post-nominal, phrased together. So this includes possessors, most quantifiers, numerals, and adjectives. The other kind, the head bears its own high tone when it combines with type 2 modifiers, which occur either before or after the head. And this is the universal quantifier and demonstrative. So these are the patterns, but I'm going to show you the actual data now. And the syntactic analysis is going to allow for these two properties to be united in coordination with the distribution of high tones. So we'll start with possession. So the possessum phrases with the possessor. So we have my shoes, this is all one phrase. And it's whether that's a pronominal possessor or a full DP like Kajumba's bird, we have the possessum and the possessor phrasing together. The head phrases with most quantifiers as well. And again, this is all what we're calling type 1 modifiers. So we have many kitchens as a single phonological phrase and another dove as a single phonological phrase. Numerals and adjectives, same pattern occurs. All right, now when you combine more than one of these types of modifiers, it looks very much like the verbal domain. So the first one phrases with the head, and any subsequent one is its own phonological phrase. So each subsequent modifier has its own prominence. All right, so the distribution of the high tones with type 1 modifiers resembles the verb phrases very closely with respect to internal arguments and low adjuncts. So like internal arguments and these low adjuncts, they're post-nominal. And the first one phrases with the noun, every subsequent one phrases by itself. Because type 1 modifiers must be located inside the XP in which the nominal head is pronounced, we know that the head noun is not located at the right edge of an XP, and we're going to take that into account when we develop the syntactic analysis. All right, so the universal quantifier now is, we're moving on to type 2, it's going to look a little bit different. So there are two ways in which it differs. One is prosodically and one is syntactically. So it can either go before or after the head. So we have the quantifier all following the head in 23A, but preceding the head in 23B. Regardless of where it surfaces, it is phrased independently. It never phrases with the head. So even when it follows the head here, book, ebitabu, has its own high tone. The demonstrative works the same way. So it can go, the demonstrative in kinu can go before or after ekitabu. In either case, ekitabu has its own high tone. Okay, and this looks a lot like clausal subjects. So like subjects, which can be postposed, type 2 nominals can surface before or after the noun. So they must be located in a position where the nominal head is pronounced, that the head noun can end up at the right edge of an XP. Okay, so we've seen the following patterns in DPs. We have type 1 modifiers that are phrased with the noun, and type 2 modifiers that are not phrased with the noun. And we saw another pattern that was more syntactic in terms of the word order. The type 1 must follow the head, type 2 can go before or after the head. When we combine these two types of modifiers, we get basically what I imagine you would predict, which is that the type 2 modifiers can go all the way to the left or all the way to the right. So we don't get them intervening between the head and the type 1. So the demonstrative can go at the beginning or at the end. Okay, so I'm going to show another structure, and this time I'm going to actually slow down and talk about how the syntax and the prosody connect to each other. But it's the structure of the DP looks a lot like the clausal structure. So the head noun undergoes a series of head movements through a number of null heads into the determiner phrase. This is compatible with the proposed clause structure I went through, and it's also consistent with Carson's account of Bantu DP. So what we have here is a DP structure where the head noun starts in N and moves into little n and through the number head and up to D head, and this complex head here. Now what you see is I'm marking off in rounded brackets the right edge of every XP. So there's a right edge of the demonstrative phrase XP, the binu, and there's the right edge on the XP on the numeral bisatu, or 3. And then there's the right edge on the adjective phrase, Bàsàa, happens to line up with the right edge of the entire DP. So that's not marked twice, it's just marked the one time. What you don't have is a right edge on the head of this phrase because it's undergone head movement, and the right edge of that XP is all the way on the right edge of the entire phrase. So that's the one that it corresponds also with where the boundary of Bàsàa comes. So you don't get the right edge of an XP next to a bitabu, you just have the X, just have the head. That means that we don't predict the high tone on a bitabu. In fact, we don't get a high tone on a bitabu. So this works out precisely the way we need it to. So when you have the head movement, each head movement doesn't generate the right edge of the phrase. When we have the demonstrative, the type 2 modifier, demonstrative, or the universal quantifier to the right, this is like an adjunction structure post-posing. So we are assuming that it joins above the DP level, which allows us to predict the boundary between the head and the post-posed modifier. All right, so this analysis correctly predicts that type 2 determiners should not surface between the noun and a type 1 modifier. So if we here we have ebitabo bisatu Bàsàa, we can put binu this at the very beginning or at the end, but we can't have it intervening between the two type 1 modifiers. So if we go back to this slide, we can see that binu can be all the way to the left, it can rotate and be right adjoined or postposed and go all the way to the right of the structure, but there's no place for it in between here, the numeral and the adjective. Okay, so here's the summary of the clausal nominal connection. We have these internal elements that appear to the right of the head, whether that's a verb head or a noun head, and they are the object and the adjunct and the verbal phrase and the type 1 modifiers for the noun phrases. Then we have these externally merged items, the subject and these type 2 modifiers that can go either to the left or to the right of the head. In either position, the head itself has its own high phrase, or its own H phrase, sorry. H tone. I'm sorry, I'm tired. Okay, so we're going to look at relative clauses. Okay, so clausal modification also comes in two types. So the first one, we did a lot of looking into whether there are other Bantu languages with this exact pattern in relative clauses, and we weren't able to find one, which is, there are a lot of different types of relative clause patterns in Bantu languages, but so far we haven't found one that looks just like Rutooro. So the relative clause head does not bear a high tone when it is modified by a reduced relative. And these reduced relatives look a lot like type 1 modifiers. The head noun does bear its own high tone when it is modified by a full relative clause, which looks like type 2 modifiers. And here too, the attachment height of the nominal relative to the head is we're going to use that to explain the prosodic phrasing. Okay, so the template for the full relative clauses. There's a relativizer, and then there is a class marker from the head, and one of the head of the relative clause, and the class marker of the subject, the negation, tense, the root, and the final vowel. Some noteworthy properties, noteworthy in terms of the typology of relative clauses in Bantu. There's no subject verb inversion. The lower negative, a lower negative, and a lower progressive marker is found in some embedded contexts, but not all. And that for these full relative clauses, both restrictive and non-restrictive readings are possible. Okay, so here we have in 28, we're comparing a matrix clause to a full relative clause. The matrix clause is just an intransitive. We have the, or no overt subject. We have the subject has its own high tone, and then the verb. Then we have a full relative clause, and the prosodic phrasing is the exact same. The difference, the reason that you can tell that this is a full relative clause in 28b is because of the relativizer. And this is, we can talk about whether this is exactly the augment or not later on. So the only difference here is that prefix. For full object relative clauses, the head bears a high. And so this is the same pattern as the full subject relative clauses. So here we have a matrix, people read books. And then we have the books that people read. So the relative clause head, book, has its own high tone. And then everything else proceeds as normal. We have the subject that precedes the verb of the relative clause. We have this relativizer, A. All right, so we're going to treat full relative clauses as CPs. And the reason is that full object relative clauses have agreement. So we have this agreement on the head with the head of the relative clause, even when it's an object. So this is going to be taken to represent agreement between the operator and the C head. Also interesting, and this is going to be important later on as well, high adverbs can surface between the subject and the verb in full object relative clauses, which they can also do in matrix clauses where we have said that subjects are topics. So in the matrix clause, the people read books yesterday. We have people yesterday read books. We have this high temporal adverb between the subject and the verb in matrix clauses. In the full relative clause, we can have ebitabu, which is the head of the relative clause, and then the subject, and then that high temporal adverb, and then the relative verb. So it looks like the full relative clauses have to have enough structure to allow for that temporal adverb to be that high. All right, so we adopt a matching analysis of relative clause formation. One reason is that the raising analysis of relative clauses is incompatible with the head movement in the DP domain, because with the raising analysis of relative clauses, you're moving a phrase, an XP within the relative clause, and then, based on the freezing principle, we should then be able to have the head movement, further head movement in the DP. So we don't have this, that's a more theory internal issue, but we don't have it with matching analysis. Like nominal heads modified by type 1 modifiers, the heads of full relative clauses are at the right edge of the phonological phrase boundary. And we can capture this prosodic similarity by attaching the relative clause above the XP in which the relative clause head is pronounced. So I'm going to show you that here. So we have these good people who read. So we have Banu, the demonstrative, being adjoined very high. Abantu barungi. So we have the subject, good people, and then abasoma, the relative clause, also adjoined high. All right, so this also explains why high determiners can precede or follow the relative clause or precede the head. So we can say with these good people who read, this can go all the way at the beginning or all the way at the end, but it can also go between the subject and the relative clause. Or sorry, the head in the relative clause. So this is what that would look like. These good people who read, we have in this particular tree is showing you the position where we have Banu, this intervening between the relative clause head and the relative clause itself, as well as following the relative clause itself. So with these adjoining these adnominals in a high position allows for that flexibility and word order. And also, of course, corresponds with the location of the right edge of the XP and the position of the high tone. All right, so turning to reduced relative clauses, the main difference, so it's the same thing where we don't have subject verb inversion. The lower negative, lower progressive marker happens in some embedded contexts. Here, though, we only have a restrictive reading, and we also don't have the relativizer, this augment on the relative clause. So here's an example of the reduced subject relative clause compared to the matrix. So we have in the matrix clause is the same matrix clause as before. We have people read, the high tone on the subject and the high tone on the verb. The reduced relative clause, all of the morphology looks the exact same because we don't have this relativizer at all. But the reason why we know that this is the people who read is now there is no high tone on people. So the head of the reduced relative clause is phrased together with the relative clause. In object relative clauses, it looks the same. The head is still not marked with a high tone. In 35, you have a reduced relative clause compared to the full relative clause. Both of these are object relative clauses. So you see two things that are different. In the full relative clause, we have a relativizer and we have the object class, or the head of the relative clause class marker marked on the relative clause. So we have that C8 on the relative clause, and we don't have either of these things in the reduced relative. We treat the reduced relative clauses as TPs. There's a typo in this slide. It should say reasons to treat reduced relative clauses as TPs. Reduced relative clauses have tense markers and the subject's class markers on the verb. And before we said with matrix clauses that agreement with the subject is found on T. But we don't have any agreement with the head in reduced object relative clauses. So it looks like we don't have the C to agree with something that high. We also have this neat thing where, again, with these adverbs, where now with the reduced relatives, these high adverbs cannot follow the subject in reduced object relative clauses like they could in matrix clauses and full relative clauses. So there is no position for these high adverbs to go. So here we had the matrix, the people read books yesterday. We have ijo before the subject and the verb in the matrix clause. In the reduced object relative, if we tried to say the books that people read yesterday, we can't do that with yesterday going between the subject and the relative clause. So it's a smaller structure. All right, so unlike full relative clauses and type 2 modifiers, the reduced relative clause head lacks a high tone. This was the same as the type 1 modifiers. So the reduced relative clauses are not at the right edge of the heads of the reduced relative clauses are not at the right edge of the phonological phrase. And we can capture this prosodic similarity between type 1 modifiers and reduced relative clauses by a syntactic analysis. So attaching the relative clause internal to the XP in which the relative clause head is pronounced. So this is what this looks like. So the people who read, this is a reduced relative clause. And we have the reduced relative clause as a TP that is in the same position as you would attach a type 1 modifier. It's internal to the phrase where that head is ultimately pronounced. So it phrases with the head. All right. And this also captures the fact that our speaker just prefers high determiners preceding the relative clause in reduced relative clauses. So you remember that with the full relative clauses, there was the option of putting the demonstrative between the relative clause head and the relative clause, but you can't do that with the reduced relative clauses. And this was very similar to the fact that we couldn't put a demonstrative between a head and an adjective, for example, the noun and the adjective. All right, so we've seen parallels between nominal and clausal structure, and that syntactic XPs map to phonological phrases. And I've argued that the distribution of the high tone on nominal heads indicate that the nominal attachment height. So whether or not the head has a high tone tells you whether the modifier is attached internal to the head's phrase or externally. And there's one exception that we will, I know that this is running a little bit long, but relative clauses with modified heads. So type 1 modifiers that precede the relative clause do not bear a high tone. The reason why this is unexpected is because with multiple DP internal modifiers, each one typically does bear a high tone. We saw that when we have multiple type 1 modifiers, any subsequent one would get its own high tone. So we have another 3 doves. We have dove 3, another both, the 3 has a high tone and another has a high tone. But if we have 5 children who read, the 5 doesn't have a high tone. So the head, the numeral, and the reduced relative clause are all phrased together, whereas we would expect, based on the other, based on just the simple noun or the simple noun phrases, we would expect a high tone on batano. Reduced object relative clauses with overt subjects are also peculiar. So the head bears a high tone, but the subject of the relative clause does not. This is unexpected because subjects always bear a high tone. The head of the reduced relative clause does not usually bear a high tone, and the subject typically does. So only in the case that you have a reduced object relative clause with an overt subject, only in this very, very specific case, do you get a high tone on a subject. Do you lose the high tone on a subject, but you gain a high tone on the reduced relative head, which you normally don't get. So in 40A, the child that the farmers don't like is a reduced object relative clause where, surprisingly, the head of the relative clause has a high tone, but the overt subject does not. And then if you compare that to people who read, which is just the reduced subject relative clause, here we have the head that doesn't have the high tone, which is what we would expect. And farmers worked, here we just have a matrix clause where the subject does have a high tone. So B and C are just meant to show you why 40A is surprising. And I'd like to, this sounds so very specific, but I want to show you that this is quite salient. The distribution of high tones is very, very straightforward and easy to perceive. So the simple matrix clause
Abantu bakasoma ebitabo.
Compared to a full object relative without an overt subject.
Ebitabo ebi basomere.
Compared to the reduced object relative with the pro-subject.
Ebitabo basomere.
And then the full object relative with an overt subject.
Ebitabo abantu ebi basomere.
Compared to the reduced object relative with the overt subject.
Ebitabo abantu basomere.
And I'll say that we collected data over a number of years and have these types of paradigms, in all different combinations of tense, aspect, mood. Over a number of years, we kept, recording in different contexts and slightly different words to see if the pattern was consistent, because we found this so puzzling, but it is so consistent. Okay, so basically the summary is that for a subset of reduced relative clauses, we have XPs that are not marked with a high tone, and heads that are marked with a high tone, even though they're not at the right edge of the phonological phrase. So that's the puzzle. One thing that we'll note is that when the reduced relative clause follows another DP internal modifier, that modifier is also not pronounced with a high tone. So the predicted prosodic structure only obtains when the order is reversed and the relative clause immediately follows the head and the additional modifier follows the relative clause. So if we have 5 children who read, abana batano basoma, we do not have a high tone on 5. But if we have abana basoma batano, we do have now the predicted order. Okay. So this is an additional, the point of showing you this is that there's additional indication that you really just can't have a high tone before the reduced relative clause. And so we're going to propose that we're going to assign a penalty to the right edge of a phonological phrase before the reduced relative clause stem. why would we do that? Doesn't weaken, so this, we had made a big point about developing a syntactic explanation for the distribution of high tones. The basic mapping constraint and a basic mapping constraint where we're saying XP corresponds to phonological phrase, but then also this highly specialized prosodic constraint appear to be doing double duty in some cases, which would weaken the analysis. So there's the redundancy when the head of the reduced relative clause is immediately followed by the reduced relative clause. But I'd like to point out that the syntactic analysis was meant to explain not only the distribution of the high tone, but it also explains, you know, what types of elements can intervene between the head and the reduced relative clause. So the word order effects that we saw. And it also unifies the syntactic treatment of different types of adnominals, so the relative clauses with the type 1 modifiers as well. And so we have to ask, why would the grammar include such a specialized prosodic constraint? Well, one thing to, again, remember that reduced relative clauses and matrix clauses are string ambiguous. So every single morpheme was the same, or it could be, I should say. And disambiguation via prosodic means is a common strategy. So so in some cases, the most faithful phrasing of a modified reduced relative clause produces an entirely ambiguous string. So here we have 42A and 42B. So if we pronounce the relative clause, the reduced relative clause, exactly like we should, it's identical to a matrix clause. And so in a sense, this is sort of like a prosodic disambiguation that is a processing cum grammatical consideration. It becomes fully grammaticalized, and even in cases where that wouldn't result in an ambiguity, there's still this rule that says no boundary before the reduced relative clause stem. Right, so this constraint, for this to work, the constraint has to be active even when the more isomorphic realization is not truly ambiguous with the matrix clause, but the fact that sometimes it could be is what motivates this constraint. Okay, then we had a second reason why these reduced object relative clauses with overt subjects are exceptional. The only time that we ever have a subject that doesn't have a high tone occurs in this type of example. And it's also the only example where we have a reduced relative clause whose head is followed by a prosodic boundary. But it's important to note that the head and the stem in fact, we want to keep the syntax because the subject agreement's always present, and the reduced object relative clauses with or without subjects represent the same amount of structure. So there's nothing else that's different. It's only the prosody. But it is consistent with this other general observation about DPs in language. So immediately adjacent DPs are always separated by phonological phrase boundaries. So here's one with the ditransitive. Here we have the nominal predicate. We always have a phrase boundary between two DPs that are adjacent. Because left edges are unmarked, and because we don't have gradient boundary cues, if we have two nouns, then followed by a relative clause, this could represent a number of different constituencies. So it could be the case that we have the second noun and the relative clause are an XP, or maybe there's no grouping internal to that string, or maybe the noun and the noun phrase are an XP. And this is what we would call prosodic, something that is prosodically indeterminate, because a single prosodic structure could map onto a couple of different syntactic constituencies. So the output of so a prosodic structure could be the output of more than one syntactic configuration, And crucially, these configurations have an analog in the language. So if we look back at the possessive structure, or the possessives, we had the possessum and the possessor phrasing together. And so we have a situation where we have a particular structure that we wouldn't want to confuse it with. So the question is, are high tones such a reliable indicator of constituency that this noun, relative clause string is disallowed because it could point to an unintended constituency where the two nouns form a constituent? And that's of course not the case in an object relative clause with an overt subject. The object, the head of the relative clause and the subject are not a constituent. So we don't want to suggest that they are. So the constraint is that we assign a penalty to adjacent DPs that are not separated by a prosodic boundary. So this basically forces a boundary between adjacent DPs. So on this account, the attested phrasing of one specific construction in the language is exceptional, but the exception allows for greater regularity in the signaling of syntactic constituency via prosody. And the viability of this explanation rests on our availability to find similar scenarios in other languages, which I leave for the future. I'm actually going to stop here because I've gone over time, and I think that's a fine place to conclude. So let's see. I will go straight to the thanks. And there is a paper that is available at NLT. Online. So I'm going to stop there. I apologize for going over.
Oh, no problem, no problem. Yeah, thank you, Lauren. If you have a question, please send me your name and your affiliation. I think the first question comes from Daisuke Shinagawa from AA
Well,
Ken.
yeah, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. And it's very interesting to me because there are not so many syntacticians working on Bantu languages in Japan, and also the most Bantuists in Japan do not work on syntax so highly. But anyway, so what I'm interested in is that the functional difference between the full relative clause and reduced relative clause. So can I have more explanation about that, about the functional difference?
I can't, I wish that I could give you more explanation than I can. I really apologize for that. What I can tell you is that I don't have an explanation for why the relative clauses can have both the restrictive and the non-restrictive readings, and the reduced relative clauses do not. So, so that's one sort of semantic, is that what you mean by functional in part? Like this, the sort of semantic difference? And also I don't know much about the use. I've never looked at these in naturalist. So I'm afraid that I'm going to come up a little bit short, but certainly that is something ideally we would want the different readings that that we would need to account for, and I can't say much about that other than what I've just said about the restrictive and non-restrictive readings. So I mean, I'm going to pull up the template for the reduced relative.
Yeah, and also maybe if it's possible, I would like to see again the examples in 41. I think there's a list of the examples.
Yes.
Yes, and also in, for example, 41b is the example of the full relative construction. And what is very interesting is here is that Ebibakasomere, and where B is actually agreed with the object, right, the book, and ba is a subject. So this is a kind of the inversion here. So the B is actually the object, but the object is actually in the slot of the subject. So which we call it object inversion. So in the full relative construction, we can see the object inversion here. But do you think it's possible for this? I mean, is it possible to in the reduced relative? Is it the object inversion can be possible there?
No. So with the reduced, do I have a typo here? Oh shoot! Wait. Reduce with the, so with the reduced relative clauses, don't have the agreement with the object. So this is terrible. This is a terrible typo. So it should, 41C, don't look at the gloss, just look at the,
yeah.
It should cut off with just C2 as ba, right? So there's no augment. This is, I hope that this didn't make it anywhere. So there's no agreement with the object in the reduced relative. There's only agreement with the object when it's an object relative clause. And so the way I think about this is that if we have a full subject relative clause, the subject agreement is actually, instead of, it should be expressed both at C, because it's the relative head, and at T, subject, but it only gets expressed once, right? So this is, I forget what Bantu syntacticians call this. Oh shoot, I'm sorry, it's slipping my mind. This has been discussed in the Bantu literature where you expect this double agreement, but you don't get it.
Right.
So you could think of it, yeah, as the object inversion, but I'm imagining it as the object, because the relative clause is as big as C, the head, that agreement takes place with the head at C, because it's the object relative. But yes, and I apologize for the copy and paste error in the gloss. There is no object.
No, that's fine. Yeah, but I think so I think that there is a relationship between the at least the object inversion is not possible. It seems to not possible in the reduced relative, but it is okay with the full relative. Yeah, so it's new to me. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Next question comes from Kubozo-sensei from Ninja.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. This language is very fascinating. If you want to understand the relationship between prosody and syntax, this language is an ideal language. I have a question on this screen, 41D and E. 41D is full relative clause, and E is a reduced relative clause. And depending on whether it is reduced full, you have different prosodic patterns, phrasing. And my question is concerns phonetic cues other than pitch, other than tone, between these two sentences. I would expect a final lengthening on the word person in D, but not in E. Is this what you find in the language?
So let me start by saying that I need to apologize. So the gloss in 41E has the same mistake as in 41C. So there's no augment or C8 there. And in other places I was glossing augment as relativizer. So with the lengthening, there's a really obvious lengthening at intonational boundaries, at a larger boundary. I have not looked, and I don't know, to be honest, if my colleague Lee Bickmore has looked at this, but it's not immediately apparent the way that lengthening is in other contexts. So if this is a phonetic, some lower level or reflex of the phrasing, I can't actually say. Do you want to, are you predicting this as?
Well, I thought there might be a phonetic cue other than pitch or tone to different phrasing patterns. So if there is, there should be final lengthening at the end of the word person in D, but not in E. But I don't know, that's a possibility.
That you asked that, because for my work on UAN, I always look for multiple phonetic cues, and part of that is because none of this is nearly, for other languages, this type of phrasing is not so obvious. Like it doesn't jump out at you in quite the same way, and so I'm always looking at both the F0 as well as the duration, but I haven't with this one. And like I said, if Lee has, I don't know about it, but that's.
Okay. Can I ask another question? What we find in many languages is the peculiar prosodic patterns shown by coordinate structures. So I was wondering if coordinate structures behave differently from other patterns. For example, the first sentence here, 41A, you have person, people as the subject. But what about coordinate structure like John and Mary in the same position? Do they form one prosodic word, or do they split into two prosodic units?
So they definitely would have, they would both have high tones. Whether or not there is, that I'm sure of, but whether or not there's some other level of gradient sort of phrasing, some other phonetic cues to finer detail in terms of the phrasing, I can't say. And one would have to assume that there is, and this is sort of, in that case, a first pass at the phonological phrasing. But yeah, they both would have their own high tone.
Oh, so if you have people and animals in the subject position, you have a high tone on both elements.
Yes.
I see. What about the verbs? If the verb is coordinate structure, like buy and eat, do the two verbs constitute separate, independent prosodic units here?
Yes, but something I don't know for sure, which would be a really, really interesting thing, and I'm glad that you brought this up, is I don't know about subjects inside of relative clauses.
No, not just in relative clauses, but right, just what, you said that at the beginning of the talk, subjects usually form one prosodic word unit, and verb and object form another prosodic word. But my question is, if the verb has two units, eat and drink, or buy and eat, instead of just one element, then do the two verbs, coordinate verbs, form independent, separate prosodic units? That's my question.
So to the best of my memory, they do, but I'm a little bit hesitant to commit to something that I can't go pull up the data and be sure. So maybe what I'll do is follow up with you, if that's okay.
Okay.
I'm not telling you things that aren't true.
Thank you.
I'll make a note of that now.
Okay. Thank you. Let's thank Laura. Lauren, sorry. Let's thank Lauren one more time. And yes, we will first wrap up the lecture, the talk, and then we will have a few more minutes continuing the discussion afterwards. Let me first thank the two assistants, Yukki Baldoria and Miyu Iizuka, as well as the Liaison Institute assistant Michinori Suzuki, who organized all the 12 talks and on 6 different days so far. Thank you very much. This event was supported by the shared budget of ICU Research Institutes, as well as Institute for Educational Research and Service, and the Linguistic Lab at International Christian University. We have a future ICU Linguistic Colloquium series planned in 2021 as well. In January and February, we have Yong Do from Hong Kong, Adam McCollum from Rutgers, Julian Stanton from New York University, and Amanda Riesling from UC Santa Cruz presenting their talks. And then from April to June in 2021, we have talks in various fields. So semantics talks will be held in April by Yuri Hara, Osamu Sawada, Satoshi Tomioka, and Hiroaki Saito. Syntax talks will be held in May by Rajesh Bhatt, Micho Yoshitaka Alwin, Benjamin Bruning, and Shin Fukuda. Phonological talks will be held in June by Mark Brunel, Mark Gerlach, Elizabeth Ziga, and Christopher Green. All the talks will be held from 10 a.m. on corresponding dates. And more information can be found on the website. So thank you all who participated in today's colloquium. We hope to see you in our next colloquium series. And at this point, the recording will be stopped.
That's it.